Hi, I'm Lana from San Francisco Historical Society. Welcome to our online presentation. Today we have Mike Weedall with us, who has just finished a book about the trial of Tokyo Rose, which many of you may not realize took place in San Francisco. So Mike is here to tell us that story. Mike, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Lana. Let me get myself opened up here. There we go.
Perfect.
Perfect. Well, hey, thank you, Lana, and thanks for the opportunity with people to share a little bit about the book I've written. This is really an important story of a woman who faced incredible challenges beyond her control imposed at a time of extreme politics and racism. And it's an important story about why San Francisco was chosen specifically by the U.S. Justice Department as the site of the trial because of the city's long history of discrimination against Japanese Americans. Typically, the first question I always get is, why did I write this book? Well, I had a career in energy, but when I retired, I always wanted to get back to my undergraduate degree in history. And in doing research, I was reading in World War II about the war in the Pacific, and the name Tokyo Rose kept popping up. And the common conception of Tokyo Rose was a seductive female voice carried over the airwaves, telling American servicemen their girlfriends and wives back home were being untrue or bragging about another Japanese victory. But when I did some research, I discovered the truth was anything but that common conception. And I was smitten. And it started me on the path of the past couple several years of doing research and writing Iva's story. So there's a lot to Iva's life, and I cannot cover it all in the short time we have today. So I'll focus on the background that took her to Japan, why San Francisco for the trial, and the trial itself. If you have questions, I'd love to entertain them. You'll see on the last slide of my presentation my email address and website, and I certainly hope that you'll be willing to reach out to me. So this is a picture of Iva Togori taken in Japan during the war. The exact year I'm not sure of, but here is a woman in her mid-20s who looks much younger. In fact, it was a common conception or reaction when people first met Iva to think she was still a teenager. Some of that certainly has to do with the pigtails that she favored at that time in her life. In fact, she would often get frustrated about why people asked her that she still wore pigtails. But look closely. Here's a young woman born in the USA who grew up in Southern California and was totally Americanized. She loved her life, her family, and her country. And despite facing racial prejudice because of her Japanese ancestry, she never wanted to be anywhere other than in the United States. But even before the start of World War II, discrimination against Japanese Americans was quite open. Japanese immigrants were legally blocked from becoming American citizens. Immigration was limited, and a common approach for Japanese coming to America was to immigrate to Canada, become a citizen there, and then use the Canadian passport to travel into the US and back to Japan. Iva's older brother was born in Japan, so he couldn't be a citizen. Since Iva was the first in her family to be born in America, she was the first citizen. One example of the discrimination Iva experienced was being denied entrance to medical school after graduating from UCLA. Even though her grades and test scores were higher than men who were accepted, she wasn't able to get in. Of course, there was also discrimination against women entering medical school at the time, a true double whammy. Starting in 1882, when the Chinese exclusion laws were passed, California businesses and farms turned to Japan as a replacement source of cheap labor. In 1905, the Asiatic Exclusion League was established in San Francisco and served as a driver of local and statewide efforts to push back against Japanese immigration. Primarily supported by labor unions concerned with protecting American jobs, more deeply rooted was nationalistic nativism, seeking to preserve Caucasian superiority. An example of the fervor in San Francisco was the school board's move to segregate schools in 1906. The diplomatic reaction by Japan brought involvement by President Theodore Roosevelt to stop the plan in return for the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 to 1908. There, Japan agreed to stop issuing passports for Japanese travelers to travel to the United States. While this attempt to restrict the mixing of races ultimately failed, new discriminatory schemes evolved and continued. This is the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle from April 22nd, 1905, announcing the establishment of the Asiatic Exclusion League in San Francisco. Again, this was sought to expand the provisions of the Chinese Exclusion Act to Japanese and Korean immigrants. There was repeated efforts by this group to introduce state legislation to force the state attorney general to ruthlessly enforce provisions against any Asians owning property. Another manifestation of discrimination was the Anti-Japanese Laundry League, founded in 1908 by the laundry workers and laundry drivers unions. The league, again based in San Francisco and promoting statewide activities, attempted to financially harm businesses run by Japanese Americans using tactics such as picketing, following customers back to their homes and intimidating them, preventing Japanese laundries from purchasing equipment, and threatening public officials who refused to take action against the laundries. Many successful Japanese businesses were ruined in this way. This is a picture of former mayor of San Francisco, James Duval Phelan. The photo was actually taken during his time serving in the California State Senate. During his days as mayor of San Francisco and throughout his political career, Phelan was an outspoken opponent of Japanese American integration. In fact, his campaign slogan when running for the state Senate was, "Save our state from Oriental aggression." The 1930s in San Francisco and the state of California saw growing fear by nativists with the rise of Japanese militarism and their invasion of China. Concern at that time also arose over the number of Japanese American schools primarily conducting classes on weekends, funded by the parents of the children who were seeking to improve language skills and develop tools for assimilation. These classes raised fears that more than English was being taught, including Japanese culture and supreme loyalty to the emperor. When Japanese Americans attempted to explain the school's real purpose, those who favored exclusion believed the worst and continued to call for action against the Japanese Americans. Certainly, West Coast fervor that started in San Francisco reached its tragic internment of Japanese Americans following the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Here's a child awaiting transportation to a camp where he would be incarcerated for the next 4 years. And this is another photo of Japantown residents in line to appear for processing as required by the Civilian Exclusion Order. As I mentioned, let's turn back to Iva Toguri and how she ended up in Japan. Because Iva was a citizen of the US, her family selected her to travel to Japan and visit her aunt's family, the Hattoris. Iva was the first child of Shizu and Jun, immigrants prohibited, as I said, to ever become citizens. Shizu, Iva's aunt back in Japan, wrote that she was ill and wanted her sister to visit. But Iva's mother, Fumi, was even more disabled. Reluctantly, Iva agreed to a 6-month visit. She departed on July 4th, 1941, her birthday. 22 days later, she arrived in Yokohama. Iva quickly learned that her aunt's illness was greatly overblown. But the thing that immediately struck Iva was the militaristic government in Japan and a country already on food rationing because of the existing war with China. She soon learned her letters home were being seized by government censors because of how critical she was of Japan. Similarly, letters from home were also being blocked. And by the time her father indicated she should leave Japan ahead of schedule, it was too late. Iva's worst fears were realized with the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan. Because of Iva's refusal in Japan to become a citizen, her family essentially forced her to move out on her own. Since the Japanese government used food to control their citizens, Iva was denied a ration card because of her outspoken loyalty to the US. She was then forced to take a series of menial jobs to buy food, often on the black market at inflated prices. Eventually, she took a position in the typing pool at Radio Tokyo, whereupon she was forced to become an announcer on the radio program Zero Hour, all because of her American accent. Her only responsibility was to introduce records played, and she steadfastly refused to participate in any propaganda broadcasts. I put this picture in showing a section of Tokyo near the end of the war. Here the bombing by the Allies was going on daily, And you can imagine the challenge for Iva or anybody in that city to just get along in a day-to-day business. Near the end of the war, for Iva and others, just commuting to work and doing shopping was extremely dangerous. August 15th, 1945, 4 years and 1 month after Iva arrived in Yokohama, the war with Japan was over. But keep in mind that peace did not bring any immediate change for Iva or others in Japan. There were still shortages of food, and Iva and her now husband Philippe were living day to day. Arriving in Japan weighing 114 pounds, by the war's end, she typically weighed 78 pounds. She traveled to Japan without a US passport, using instead what was called a certified letter of identification. Until she could now secure a passport from the American embassy, it was not clear how she'd be able to get back home, including getting enough money to pay for that transportation. Because Iva was also aware that her family had been interred during the war and was in no position to offer any financial aid. Into this situation, enter Harry Brundage. Harry was a correspondent for Cosmopolitan magazine at the time and one of the first reporters to get into Japan with the initial wave of Army occupation troops. As a reporter, Brundage knew the two most famous people in Japan that Americans wanted to hear about were the Emperor and Tokyo Rose. Since the Emperor was off limits and protected by the US military, Brundage set out to determine and to get an interview with whoever was Tokyo Rose. In fact, there was never anyone who broadcast by the Japanese for the Japanese using that title. And over 20 women broadcast at Radio Tokyo and Radio Manila for the Japanese. The name Tokyo Rose was actually one invented by Allied soldiers and sailors who loved to listen to the Japanese programs like the Zero Hour, because the Japanese played better American music typically than the Allied broadcasts, and they'd love to listen to the outrageous claims of victories that the American soldiers and sailors knew weren't true but found entertaining. One of the managers at Radio Tokyo told Brundage Iva Toguri was Tokyo Rose. So the reporter tracked her down and offered $2,000 for an interview. The offer of this money was a solution to the couple's check problems. She told Brundage up front that there was no Tokyo Rose, but the reporter responded that if she agreed to take the identity, she would be seen as a hero to the many troops who were entertained during the war. And don't you really need $2,000, Iva? Iva agreed and signed a contract exclusively giving the story to Brundage. Then she made a naive and inexperienced decision when she gave 2 interviews in subsequent days that violated the confidentiality clause of Brundage's contract, so that she never got any compensation. What Iva didn't know was the reputation of Brundage as an unscrupulous reporter who cared little for the truth. The reporter's story that he sent back home identified that Iva committed treason, and the papers and media nationally in the United States picked up this story. The next key character in Iva's story is Walter Winchell, a true muckraking journalist of the 40s. Like Brundage, Winchell's reputation was someone who never let facts get in the way of sensationalizing a story. His ruthlessness made him a feared man in political circles. Besides writing one of the most popular columns carried in Hearst papers nationally, his radio broadcast on Sunday evening was must listening. He took the story written by Brundage claiming Iva was Tokyo Rose and made her a truly hated figure. As the 1948 presidential election started to heat up, Harry Truman was being accused of being soft on communism and treason. A convenient target to answer that charge now was Iva Toguri. Attorney General Tom Clark, who desperately wanted his boss Harry Truman to be reelected, soon joined Winchell in calling for Iva's prosecution. This is one of the mugshots of Iva taken during her first arrest in 1946. With the press stories back in the US, the 8th Army investigators and lawyers decided to incarcerate Iva and determine if there were reasons to bring charges. That investigation took over 1 year. During that time, Iva was held in isolation and only allowed one 20-minute visit per month from her husband. It was while she was in prison she started getting letters from her family, where she learned that her mother died shortly after being interned in a horse barn in Tulare, California. This initial year-long investigation conducted by the Army and Justice Department eventually concluded Iva was innocent of any wrongdoing. She was released, whereupon she and Philippe renewed planning how they could move to the United States. However, the drumbeat by Winchell, with support from the Attorney General, soon led to a second arrest for treason and transportation back to the US for trial. This is the USS General Hodges. This ship was specifically chosen to transport Iva to San Francisco. By American law, Americans residing overseas and accused of treason must be tried in the federal district court where the individual first steps foot on American soil. Ships traveling from the Orient typically made stops in either Alaska or Hawaii for resupply. Likewise, transporting Toguri by air during that period would also require refueling at an American base. So the General Hodges was specifically chosen because of its capability to sail nonstop to San Francisco, where Justice Department attorneys insisted the trial must occur. So what was the prosecution's rationale? Why not hold the trial in Anchorage or Honolulu? Hawaii was rejected because of the significant Japanese American population, sparking fear of seating a sympathetic jury to the relatively weak case the Justice Department knew they had. The 49th state was dismissed as simply an inconvenient location. There was even an exploration of flying Toguri to northern Canada from Japan, then bringing her to trial on the East Coast, where few Japanese Americans resided. In the end, because of the long history of discrimination against Japanese Americans in San Francisco, the Justice Department settled on transportation to that city. So this is not an exact cell Iva was confined to for 22 days during transit to San Francisco, but I wanted to show because it represents the type of conditions she was confined to. She was locked in this space for the entire voyage, including taking her meals. Because of intestinal issues that she carried from her days trapped in Japan with inadequate food and seasickness she suffered during the voyage, by the time of her arrival, Iva had lost even more weight, and so much so she couldn't even keep her skirt up without the use of safety pins. Here Iva is being transported in San Francisco by FBI agents. I believe the agent accompanying Iva is Frederick Tillman. Tillman, like a lot of post-war Americans, carried a deep hatred for the Japanese. This agent's actions to arrange perjured testimony from Iva's Radio Tokyo co-workers was critical in her ultimate prosecution. This is Wayne Collins meeting with Iva during her trial in San Francisco. And seating to the left of Iva and behind her is her sister June and her father Jun. Collins was famous for being drawn to the underdog in legal proceedings. Wayne was also the only lawyer who took action against the US government for the internment of Japanese during the war. Many attorneys objected to the internment action of the US government, but Collins was the only attorney who took the cases to court. Ultimately, he lost twice in the Supreme Court. But he was also the only attorney who fought the eviction of Japanese in another case when those individuals had agreed to leave the US at the end of the war in return for getting out of an internment camp early. Collins' successful suit in that case saved over 5,000 Japanese Americans from being forced to leave America at the end of the war. Taking on another unpopular case and defending Iva was testament to this man's commitment to fighting the government when he saw an illegal action. Another picture of Iva during a break in the trial. The key witness against Iva was Colonel Shigatsu Tsunashi, who was the Japanese army commander at Radio Tokyo during the war. Tsunashi often threatened POWs with death if they didn't cooperate and work at Radio Tokyo, and Iva was quite aware of those threats whenever she had to deal with the colonel. It was later proven Tsunashi and other witnesses from Radio Tokyo perjured themselves, testifying Iva broadcast propaganda and supported the Japanese government. As I mentioned earlier, the Attorney General, Tom Clark, father of Ramsey Clark, was centrally involved in the election effort of his boss, President Truman. Clark made it clear he wanted a prosecution at all costs, and the Justice Department attorneys and FBI followed his direction. One historical note is, after Iva was eventually released from prison in 1956, the chief prosecutor in the trial, Tom DeWolf, committed suicide. DeWolf didn't leave a suicide note, but from conversations with his fellow attorneys at the Justice Department, the consensus was DeWolf never got over the travesty of justice he committed at the direction of the Attorney General. This dashing figure is Charles Cousins, an Australian colonel in the war who was captured in the Philippines and the key defense witness for Iva. Once the Japanese learned Cousins was a famous radio broadcaster in Sydney before the war, he was forced to put together the zero-hour radio program under threat of death. Cousins and Iva worked hard to sabotage those broadcasts, and there's little evidence of any lasting propaganda value from the zero-hour program. Cousins defended Iva, testifying she only introduced music and never wrote any of her own scripts. Felipe Daqui was a Portuguese citizen that Iva met in Japan and married in 1944. Felipe's father emigrated to Japan to work in the Ford Motor Plant, where he met a Japanese woman that he married. Felipe was therefore eligible for dual citizenship, but refused to become a Japanese citizen because of his dislike of the militaristic society. Felipe also traveled to the US to testify on Iva's behalf, but the FBI insisted that Felipe's visa be limited to only being in America to testify, and then never to be allowed to enter the US again. Literally the day Felipe's testimony concluded, the FBI hustled him onto the SS Tradewinds, where he is pictured here, without even allowing Felipe to say goodbye to his wife, Iva. The conditions imposed by the US for Daqui visa ended the viability of Iva and Felipe to stay married. Iva said more than once, not only were they out to get me, but they were determined to ruin my marriage. Judge Michael Roach, who presided in Iva's trial, is pictured on the left. Years after the trial, Iron Mike was quoted more than once to say that he knew from the start Iva was guilty. His ruling severely limited the defense, for example, disallowing any number of defense witnesses and allowing the prosecution more resources to bring witnesses from Japan. In his 70s at the trial, it was not unusual for Roach to fall asleep during the proceedings, forcing attorneys on both sides to back up and bring the judge up to speed. After the most expensive trial pursued by the US government to that point in history, $700,000, Iva was convicted on one of the 8 charges brought against her. Article 6, speaking about ships being sunk. Whether Iva actually spoke those words is a key question. But even if she was forced to read a script written by the Japanese long after Charles Cousin was moved out of Radio Tokyo and no longer there to protect her, is insignificant in the scheme of things. The battle the Japanese referred to as Leyte Gulf. Instead of all the American ships being destroyed, as the Japanese claimed, it was the final naval battle in the Pacific where the Japanese Navy was totally destroyed. Further, the broadcast was 5 weeks after the actual fighting ended, so American servicemen already knew this was more preposterous Japanese propaganda. Iva stated during the trial and for the rest of her life, she never spoke those words. 3 jury members later publicly expressed regret on getting worn down and agreeing to a guilty verdict. Those 3 said later they expected a light sentence from Judge Michael Rose, who instead sentenced Iva to 10 years, a $10,000 fine, and took her citizenship away. This is the entrance to Alderson Prison in West Virginia, where Iva was assigned to serve her sentence. Imagine her feelings passing through these gates, knowing jurors now regretted their conviction. Since first being arrested in 1946 during that 1-year-long investigation, she had now been in various jails for 4 years and faced another 10 years of incarceration. This is Mildred Gillers, also known as Axis Sally. She is the only other woman prosecuted for treason after World War II. She was sentenced to a much longer term than Iva, was fully deserving of being prosecuted since she willingly and actively collaborated with the Nazis. I like to throw this in because Mildred and Iva ended up spending many hours together as bridge partners. But per their upfront agreement, they never discussed what they did during the war or what happened during their treason trials. Once Gellers taught Iva bridge, they rarely lost as a team. Iva was granted parole 6 years into her sentence because of her record as a model prisoner. Here she is leaving Alderson Prison with Chicago detectives seeking to run interference. The 2 detectives that escorted Iva were arranged by her dad, since there were over 100 members of the press waiting for her at her 7 a.m. release. What the detectives did was to take Iva to a car hidden around the corner of the prison administration building, then speed away with someone in the back seat covered with a blanket. The press took the bait and rushed to follow the 2 detectives, while Iva and her family stole away in a family car along secondary roads back to Chicago. Once Iva was in Chicago, where her family settled after the war, She continued to be a target of hatred. Often a Chicago police car was stationed outside her apartment building to discourage those who wanted to harass her. She didn't venture out often, and when she did, she wore a disguise and was often accompanied by a Chicago police detective. Dr. Clifford Ueda was a pediatrician in San Francisco and quite active in the Japanese American Citizens League. Upon retirement, he stumbled across a master's thesis written by John Haida of the University of San Francisco in 1971, who documented for the first time the terrible injustices in Iva's trial. Ueda then led an effort to form a committee in the JACL and approach Iva to apologize for the organization's silence during the trial. That silence by Japanese Americans was a result of the extreme politics and lingering hatred during the period following World War II. Iva initially rebuffed Ueda's approach, saying she just wanted to stay quiet and avoid the negatives that came with any publicity about her. Ueda and several committee members then flew to Chicago and unannounced knocked on her door to apologize. That was the start of the road to a presidential pardon. Iva Toguri Takino, victim of a legend. This is the pamphlet the JASCL created and then used as part of its national outreach campaign to turn around public opinion. This pamphlet was the primary tool that they used to communicate with news organizations and interest groups in the country. For the legal work in putting together the presidential pardon application, Wayne Collins Jr. took the lead after his father was killed in a plane crash returning from Hawaii. As a little boy, Iva actually coached Wayne Jr. in math during one of the government's attempts to have her deported following her release from prison. Wayne Jr. often said the only reason he got through high school math was because of Iva's coaching. Wayne Jr. often told Iva as a youngster how much he admired the work his father did and took up Iva's case once his father tragically passed away. Like his father, Wayne Jr. refused to take any fee for working on the appeals process. Another key person turning Iva's story around was Bill Curtis, who at the time was a young newsman in Chicago when national dialogue on the miscarriage of justice was heating up. For some time, he had been a friend of Toguri's. So when the Chicago Tribune carried a series of articles on Iva's trial, including confessions by Radio Tokyo co-workers that they perjured themselves, that morning the Toguri Mercantile store was besieged by reporters and media. Not knowing what to do, Iva called Curtis and asked for advice. Slipping in the back door, Curtis huddled with Iva and shared that he had already contacted Walter Cronkite, who wanted to do an interview with Iva on the news that evening. When Iva asked what to do about the many press out front of the store, Curtis said, ignore them and enjoy the free advertising. The Cronkite interview led to a story on the new program 60 Minutes a few months later with Morley Safer. Curtis watched the 60 Minutes broadcast with Iva and her family, and at the end noted this would be powerful in getting President Gerald Ford to grant the presidential pardon, since Ford never missed 60 Minutes. Today, Curtis is the announcer and scorekeeper on the NPR radio program, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. He's been quite giving and sharing information as I wrote my book. This is Senator Daniel Inouye of California. As a close confidant of President Gerald Ford, Inouye was critical in lobbying for the presidential pardon. Once the application was submitted, the senator reached out to Iva to share how much he supported her being granted a pardon. He also told the story about his father getting stuck in Canada and being unable to get processed into the United States with his then pregnant wife who was about to give birth because of a paperwork glitch. Jun, Iva's father, rushed to Vancouver and intervened so the pregnant woman would not be put on a ship back to Japan where the baby would be born at sea. The couple was allowed to enter the US and that baby was born a US citizen, Daniel Inouye. Here's another picture of young Inouye as a lieutenant who fought with distinction in Italy and France against Germany for the US. He was typical of so many young Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight for the country they loved. President Gerald Ford signed the pardon for Iva, restoring her full citizenship. The pardon was signed just 2 hours before Ford left office and was succeeded by Jimmy Carter. This is the Toguri family store in Chicago that Iva managed after the passing of her father and older brother. This store operated until 2017 when it was closed. After her pardon, Iva was able to lead a more peaceful life with much reduced harassment. Philippe filed for divorce in 1980. He had met another woman and wanted to formalize their relationship. Iva didn't contest the divorce, although she was always bitter with the government to not allow Philippe to travel again to the US. In the 29 years following the presidential pardon, Iva managed the family store, as I said, leading the quiet life she always dreamed of. Iva Tagore died on September 28, 2016, of a stroke at age 90. Iva once said that she always thought she would have a difficult life. After her pardon, her last years, as I said, were spent peacefully. She even started to make a few annual trips to Florida, where she would meet with some of the retired prison guards she got to know from Alderson. But in the end, the life she sought as a proud American was destroyed by her government. Despite being loyal in the most trying circumstances in Japan, sacrificing her own health to get food and medicine for POWs in Tokyo, being falsely identified as Tokyo Rose, losing her only baby in Japan, and having the FBI destroy her marriage, she was always strong and wanting to do the right thing. So that's a little bit I wanted to share today. So thank you for joining me. It's taken me years to get this book to the point where I feel it's ready to tell her full story. And I think, as I said before, that her story is really important. Iva was a courageous and tenacious woman who faced difficulties that many of us cannot imagine. Plus, I believe what led to her prosecution is a warning for all of us today, as our political environment contains many of the same extremes and racism. There's so much more I'd love to share with you today, but I guess you'll have to read the book. Lana?
Mike, that was a fascinating presentation. I learned a ton from it. You've done amazing research and illuminated a lot of the issues that happened at that time that I think time has helped us forget, and wrongly so. So thank you for that. I'm sure our members and viewers will enjoy your presentation greatly, and I encourage people to reach out to Mike with questions and also buy the book. I know I will buy a copy. So thank you, Mike. Much appreciated.
Terrific. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye now.